Hi there, welcome to another episode of From Ireland to Palestine. Today's guest is John Barry, who describes himself as a recovering politician. He's now Professor of Green Political Economy at Queen's University, Belfast. He's also co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission. He's been active in Palestine campaigning for a long time. He's going to talk to us today about Queen's University's own complicity in the genocide, general atmosphere around academia and Palestine. And we'll also get into his own specialties, the green side of things, the ecocide that's taken place in Gaza and how that ties into the Holocaust, which is still ongoing there. So, John, welcome to the podcast. So, as I said in the intro there, you're a recovering politician. Is that a little bit like you were in academia, I think, originally, then went into politics a bit for the Green Party, and now you're back into academia? So is it a bit like the old Tony Benn quote about leaving Westminster to spend more time on politics?
Well, I've always been an academic activist. Even when I was elected councillor for the Green Party, I never left the day job, as it were.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as if I did one and then went back to the other. I was always doing them together, particularly my area of politics and political economy.
Mm-hmm.
It was a natural synergy. But I'd also say I'm a very anxious parent. That's part of the reason why I do a lot of the work I do on climate and ecological issues. And perpetually pissed off and angry. And the things we can get into, injustice, the ecocide, genocide going on in Gaza, and the complicity of universities in that. So for me, we can't have the production of knowledge in the academy without some knowledge and engagement with politics. The two of them are, natural bedfellows.
Sure, yeah. We'll get into, I suppose, how that's being compromised by the clampdown on the genocide, examples in the US and otherwise. But just speaking about QUB itself specifically, what's it like being someone on the left in there? It's perceived as being like a fairly conservative institution. Is that the case? And what's it like working in that environment?
Sometimes you're as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit, in the great Billy Connolly phrase.
Yeah.
People have this mistaken view of universities as kind of these woke, liberal places where we have 3 months off every year and we're corrupting the minds of the young with left-wing, cultural Marxist, critical race theory and so on. If only.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly conservative institution, increasingly in my 35 years as an academic, that has become much more like a business rather than the institution I joined back in the 1990s, of a critical space for thinking, of encouraging students to be critically aware of the world around them. And I have to say, I'm ashamed of my university. We have Hillary Clinton as our chancellor.
Yeah.
Warmonger, patronising in our statements about students protesting about the genocide, particularly in America. Kind of mealy-mouthed statements from our management. They haven't used the word genocide in any press statement. They had to be forced to agree to divest from any collaboration with Israeli institutions. I'm not even sure they've completely done that.
Apparently not. Yeah.
Whereas Trinity College Dublin, to be fair, on the island of Ireland, that's the leader in terms of, and the comprehensive decision that the university made there was as a result of a student encampment. And it just shows you that, sadly, even though in academia we like to think that it's the force of the better argument and debate that wins the day, often it's boots on the ground or bums on the ground and protest and sit-ins. These can deliver real results. As well as, just to conclude, my own experience of being an active trade unionist on campus is that universities don't fear strikes. What they fear is negative publicity in the press. And often there's a combination of direct action, negative social media and mainstream media commentary on the university that sometimes can bring them kicking and screaming to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that is the case. I mean, it's a Chomsky. I'm always quoting Chomsky. I think I'm still stuck in my student Chomsky phase, but there's like the quote from him about politics basically being decided by force and by power, and that is, like you say, even way in the one place you'd expect it to be purely done on a rational basis argument. It's not the case. It's just the weight of force you can bring to bear on things.
But also, as Chomsky said, he said there's a narrow bond or realm of debate.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have critical, furious debate, but we're not often asking the bigger questions about the structures, imperialism, colonization, and so on. Now, don't get me wrong, some colleagues do, but everything from, physics to pharmacy to politics are all implicated. It's not just in the arts, humanities, social sciences, but that's very rarely brought out and so on. So in my view, the university now is fully complicit in maintaining the status quo of capitalism, of globalization, of imperialism, even though you do have the odd voice like me and others offering alternative views as an institution. It's now an adjunct of the state and the market. But I would say that because I'm an L-Marxist.
Aye, as am I. But I mean, is it in terms of where the pressure's coming from in Queen's or in universities more broadly? Do you think it's coming from the top, from the bosses? Is it coming from outside? Is it coming from your colleagues? And what's the difference between your colleagues? Is it would the thought control come from people within the politics department, or is it just apathy from people in other departments, or how does it break down?
Well, I think you can gauge the engagement of, say, academic colleagues by how many of us go to Palestine solidarity rallies. Is very few.
Very few, yeah.
I think I've taken my union banner twice, UCU union banner.
And your pink hat.
With the pink hat, and it's a very, noticeable. So, yeah, there's been some but very patchy engagement by staff, which, there's a variety of reasons. People maybe be afraid. The university is full of people on precarious fixed-term contracts, and absolutely I wouldn't expect them. But I have to say I am pissed off with other colleagues like me who are professors. They've got minimal maybe caring responsibilities, children grown up and parents okay or either passed on. Where are they in this? I mean, for someone like me, it's relatively safe and there's little risk for me to be very prominent in the media or to go on marches and make speeches or have events at the university. But there's very few like me. I can count probably on the one hand. So I'm curious as to what's going on in some of my senior colleagues' minds. They're obviously seeing the genocide that's going on in Gaza, the Holocaust, as you've described it quite accurately. What the fuck are they doing? How are they? Maybe they're doing other things. They're giving money, or they could be doing things behind the scenes, which I hope some of them at least are doing. But it would be good if it wasn't just me and a handful of other academics, senior academics, that were at these events that I know you've been, quite prominently at as well over the last, almost coming up now to nearly 2 years.
2 years, yeah. Yeah, I suppose I completely agree. There isn't really an excuse for that, and increasingly we're seeing activists out in the streets facing actual violence. I think as a far righter seem to have us in their crosshairs increasingly. So that's getting more fraught. So for people who are merely very loosely risking their careers, you could say, it's harder to justify. I suppose the one thing you could say in their defence is I don't know if it's the same here, but there's the example of Norman Finkelstein in the United States, who often talks about how he's never been able to get a teaching job since. Yeah, you probably know the case. Yeah. So does that? Do you think there's any risk of that here at all, or is that?
Well, I think certainly if you're a younger academic, I completely understand you're making a calculation in terms of maybe moving on or moving up in terms of your career. But for someone like me, I'm almost 60. I know it's hard to believe. But I'm looking at now retirement, and there are many more like me. So for me, we're the ideal people who should be stepping up and stepping out. So it's not necessarily when I criticise academics for not maybe being more prominent in the Palestine liberation and solidarity movement. I'm not criticising all colleagues. There are a whole variety of reasons why they may not be able to get involved. But there's certainly, a minority of senior academics, some of whom would describe themselves as critical theorists or Marxists or socialists or anti-imperialists. Where are you?
Do you talk to them about it? Do you ask them what's stopping you, or?
To be honest, no, because some of these people I didn't see when we were out on strike for the past almost 5 years. And I fear for me being able to keep calm, maybe in calling them out as scabs, because some of them were scabs, even though that's a term that I was told I shouldn't use on the picket line, but they are scabs, people who cross the picket line and go to work when the rest of us are striking. And it was kind of like a Venn diagram, the same people who were not involved in the strike action, even though some of them are members of the union, some of them weren't members of the union, and the ones who are absent in terms of the biggest issue, certainly in my life and probably since the Second World War. And this is a world historical moment we're now going. And I do want to ask them, maybe I should go and speak with them. I do invite them to all the events I put on at the university as part of the QUB Palestine Assembly. None of them ever come. We see the same people all the time. But maybe that's the question I could ask them, how are they going to explain this to their kids in the history books? What were you doing, Daddy or Mummy, at this time? Because whatever you can do something. We'll all do something. And it's for them to say what it is they're doing or why it is they're not being as prominent as some of the other academics. And I'm not even the most prominent, certainly across Ireland. There's much more active people than me. But I would like to ask, what's going on for them? Some of them may be Zionists, which I absolutely disagree with, but I can understand it. But those who have some sense of sympathy, and I think there's a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians, but we need to move that to solidarity. It's not enough to just feel sad and stop doom scrolling, which we should do, folks, every so often. Just don't be going, because it's too overwhelming. Yeah. But while I would say there's maybe higher levels of sympathy privately within academia, I'm seeing less solidarity.
Yeah. I think there's definitely some Zionist element in Queen's, isn't there? Isn't there still a Friends of Israel? I think
there might be. There probably is.
Yeah.
So I haven't looked into that, but I can do on your behalf if you want me to.
It'd be useful to know. I remember when we were, like, before term ended, when we were working with the Queen's ones, they mentioned a Friends of Israel there. Right. I don't know if it's still in operation. And then there's just the general Queen's Complicity, which you spoke about a little bit. Like, there's lots of things. They're apparently still involved in research partnerships through the EU Horizon programme. Yeah,
so, and the argument is that there are legal implications they can't get out of, and I have to say maybe that's correct. But I do think that they could be doing an awful lot more. Particularly, and I want to shout out to my colleague Brian Kelly, who's been solid in terms of Palestine solidarity. He's done a lot of work. Liaising with the university, working behind the scenes we have 4 COPTI scholarships.
Yeah.
So we have 4 scholarships for Palestinian students to do master's degrees. But to me, that's a drop in the ocean. I don't want to, dismiss that. It's a gesture, but the university is an incredibly well-endowed organisation. It could be doing an awful lot more to support the reconstruction. And, the university was out in Cairo earlier this week with Palestinian educators in terms of how can we rebuild Palestine's education infrastructure, because we not only have genocide and ecocide, the scholasticide, utter destruction. There's no universities, there's no schools left in Palestine. But I do think the university could be doing an awful lot more in terms of material help for Palestinian scholars at risk. And, particularly the last thing I'd say, and, again, something that we'd all know in the Palestine Solidarity Liberation Movement, is the hypocrisy. Yeah. So when the war in Ukraine came out, our university, like others, were quick to condemn Russia, put in place funded programs for scholars at risk, and so on. Never mind then governments in Britain and Ireland and elsewhere taking in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. Where have we seen that in terms of Palestine? So I think that's something that still needs to be worked upon. So the university has done a little, but it really is a drop in the ocean to what it could be doing.
Yeah, I think that's the thing we've got to do in future, isn't it? It's got to be kind of constantly calling these people out in future for their hypocrisy. Like anyone who attempts to speak on human rights in any situation, if they didn't speak out meaningfully on Gaza, they have to be interrupted in the middle of their lectures or talks or whatever and called out again and again and again.
Absolutely. I'm not saying colleagues might want to follow my lead, but I know since the genocide started, I wouldn't say every lecture or seminar that I give, but every course that I teach or co-teach on has brought in Gaza and what's going on. Because sadly, it's a teachable moment. It's bringing together all this shit that's happening in the world in terms of the climate crisis. So you can't have climate justice without Palestine liberation. We're talking about imperialism. We're talking about the incredible division between the global north and the global south, the refugee crisis of people migrating and then being met with guns, or the disgraceful attitude of the European Union. It's really revealed its own ugly face, that this Europe of human rights and so on. As soon as the genocide started, what did Ursula von der Leyen do? Fly to Jerusalem.
Ursula von der Leyen.
Yeah, fond of flying. So for me, as an educator, you can use what's going on now in terms of the genocide, ecocide, scholasticide, the human rights, and in particular, and again, I've always been pro-Palestinian, even going back to being a secondary school student. There's a picture of me in 1985 with a keffiyeh in my school photograph, which my parents were horrified at, because back in them days in Dublin, we called them PLO scarves because they were in support of the Palestinian Liberation Organisation. So I've always had, like a lot of Irish people, a default pro-Palestinian position, but many of us just become much more educated over that time. And that's what we should be doing as educators. And certainly I've become much more knowledgeable, able to bring in what's happening in Palestine in terms of racism, colonialism, imperialism, and so on, as I've spoken about. But then particularly seeing the ways in which Palestinian resistance and this concept that I have recently come across called sumud, which is this Palestinian idea of everyday resistance and persistence. And the image is often of the olive tree and the mother, in terms of these are people who are not going to be removed from the land. And I think, in a way that you should, if you're teaching human rights, or you're teaching refugee studies or migration or the climate crisis or militarism, if you're not talking about Palestine and the genocide that's going on there, you're being derelict as an educator, in my view. And also, the last thing I'd say is that, and this part of my pedagogy, the way I teach, I always use newspaper headlines from the week before I give the class, so that's relevant to or something from social media. Well, there's this thing happening in which all of these things that are going wrong in the world, they've all just like been, focused in this crucible, in this tiny territory in the world, that if you want to understand the legacies of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, this is the place to do it. So as an educator, I think you're being derelict by not using this as a way of connecting with the lived experiences of your students, to connect even dead white guys that we teach in political theory, Plato, Machiavelli, Marx, and so on. You can use, with enough imagination, connect these ideas, which a lot of students find difficult, because I'm reading this dead white guy from 2,000 years ago, but you can connect with what's going on now as an example.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a much more graphic example, Gaza, than past history, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's one thing to teach the Nazis or whatever, but this is modern day Nazism. And we shy away from that comparison, but I think it's completely valid now. I don't think there's anything else that really fits the bill.
Sure.
And that what you were talking about using recent headlines. I've heard of other left politics professors using that as a technique to teach media as well. They come in every day and they just pick up whatever newspaper headlines that day, and they look like this is the bias.
Yeah.
And they don't really even have to prepare for it. It's just you get so.
Oh no, I use it. It's wonderful having the Belfast newsletter on the one hand and the Irish News on the other, and you just say, right, why is this story? It could be about Palestine. It could be about a homophobic attack. Why in the Belfast newsletter is it page 7, tiny little bit at the bottom of the page, and yet in the Irish News it's front page and so on. So you have to do a lot of work in a way. The ideological biases, speak for themselves, and it's trying to encourage students, probably less so with legacy or mainstream media, but certainly trying to teach them media literacy, particularly in the online space, which I'm very worried about as a citizen, as a parent, as an educator, that a lot of our students, particularly now with the advent of GPT and AI and so on, that they're beginning to lose their critical faculties, that their attention is being colonized, and they're often not able, or they don't care about, is this actually true? And so on. So, and again, we've seen that with the Holocaust in Palestine, a lot of fake news going around, and the ways in which the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces, put out press statements. You say, how do we know this is even true?
Yeah.
Surely we should have a default position that whatever they say is wrong and false until it's proven
innocent.
otherwise, because they have a vested interest in portraying a particular view of what's going on. There is no famine. Give me a fucking break.
Yeah.
And we didn't even need the report that's come out today. The report out today that's said there is a famine. We've already known that, and so on. And so these are all, excellent ways for young, critical minds that are going to be inheriting whatever the aftermath of this is, to be aware of its origins, and so that they're forearmed, as it were, in terms of not being fooled.
Yeah. And what you're talking about there, there's Channel 4, I think it was yesterday, where they were speaking to an Israeli brigadier general, and he was being shown a picture of a starving child, and he's just flatly saying that's not real, and everything we see out of Gaza just isn't real. There's loads of food, there's no famine.
Yeah.
So they use it. I think he probably genuinely believed it, but that's what they try and do to their own population as well. Is just try and sustain that idea.
Add it up, but it's also, this is the educator in me. I'd be using that in class. That example you gave of post-truth.
Yeah.
And what that is, most of us have this naive view that the truth is opposed to the lie. So you're offering a lie. Post-truth is even worse. Post-truth, at least a lie, you've got to do a lot of work to try and offer an alternative version of the event or the facts or history or something.
You have to have some grain of truth in it.
Yeah, post-truth is you don't give a shit about the truth.
Yeah.
And that's the Trumpian, Steve Bannon, flood the field kind of world we live in, where, scientific truth, I don't believe climate change. Well, what's your evidence for that? No, it's how I feel.
Yeah.
And so it's this very worrying stage we are now as a society, where facts are not accepted, science is denigrated, expertise is ridiculed because you're part of the woke elite, and so on. And it means then that a lot of our citizens are in this kind of Venn diagram of anti-vax, anti-climate change, that there's a genocide going on. And we don't have to go too far in this city to find people of that view. I meet them every day. When you walk around with a T-shirt like this, you get spat on and, pro-Israel. And you get a lot of people supporting you and so on. But there is that worry that we now live in this world of this post-truth idea, which again, as I said earlier, it's not that you propose a lie against the truth. You don't give a shit about the truth.
I know some things like Fox News is something I said to people a while ago, is that it's not merely that they want you to mistrust the left or mistrust left-wing politicians. There's a concerted attempt to sow doubt in science itself.
Yeah.
And anything that comes out, like you say, it's presented as woke or it's coming from an elite. So therefore, it's completely a rational argument. Obviously, the truth of an argument doesn't depend on the person making it.
What sometimes helps, because I've often had these discussions, particularly with a lot of evangelical Protestants when I was a counsellor. They would deny the science, and I say, well, do you have a phone? Have you ever gone to hospital and needed medical attention, maybe using a machine? I said, well, so why do you trust that science and not this one? And what it turns out is that they don't like the implications. It's, for a lot of people, that it's not even that they're against climate change science, is that they've quickly gone from climate change is perhaps real, and to address it, we're going to need, a challenge to capitalism. They often associated them with women's rights and trans issues and so on. So they quickly connect it. So they're not really against climate change at all. They're associating it with another set of cultural attacks on their conservative beliefs and so on. But sometimes you can win people around by saying, well, why do you believe that science and not this science? What's really going on here? But at the end of the day, sometimes you can't fix stupid. And I spent far too long in my life, particularly as a politician, wasting a lot of time trying to convince people that I just sort of said, listen, like at Mrs. Brown, that's nice, and move on. Because sometimes there's no point.
Yeah. And we have that issue all the time at protests and things. You're confronted by Zionists, and is what you do. Do you shout over the top of them? Do you ignore them? Do you try and convince them otherwise? And so it's always a difficult thing.
But what I found as a politician, because I was on the most unionist-dominated council, the old North Down council before the local government. I was like literally the token tag on the council. And what I found that really pisses off your political enemies is being nice to them.
Right, yeah.
So because it doesn't fit the script.
Yeah, you got to be raging.
Or you agree with them and say, that's actually a good point, but maybe, You know, so if you want to piss off your enemies, yes, you could try and engage, shout over them and so on. But sometimes you can do more like an Aikido move as opposed to a karate move. You know, Aikido is where you take the energy of your opponent and so on. So sometimes, you know, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Because sometimes you can piss them off even more and confuse them because you're not supposed to do that.
Aye. Well, that's the minimum satisfaction you should try to get is just by pissing them off. If you can't win the argument, at least piss them off a wee bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That they are just reflexively primed for hostility as well.
Yeah.
So if you, like you say, it does disarming if you try and come at them a little bit more.
I think if
friendly.
you use a couple of Fukalas Gaelga as well in Bangor Town Hall, as I found, and throw in the odd comrade and declare yourself a Marxist, it really
throws a spanner in the works.
Particularly when I was a counsellor, I mean, they didn't know what to do with me because I was a professor, Queen's, an academic, and I used to wear what I'm wearing now, shorts. I'd always have a politically motivated T-shirt on. Yeah. I'd sometimes cycle to the council meetings. They just didn't know what to do with me. And then I was a pretty good speaker. I'm quite self-deprecating, using humour and so on. So there are all sorts of tactics, and it's partly personality-based, but there are ways in which you can operate, even in a particularly, you know, brutal environment, in which you can still maintain your own dignity while also, you know, sparring as needed.
Yeah. It's a bit like, I suppose it's like the inverse of what Trump's done. Trump has broken all the rules and nobody seems to know what to do with him, his opponents. The media, nobody has found an answer to it yet, and so what you're doing is kind of the saintly inverse of that. Yeah. We're just going back to Queen's a wee bit, just briefly. I mean, obviously they're tied in heavily into not just into things like the research project. It's things like I noticed recently they're praised by the ADS group, who's a lobby group for the aerospace, defence, and security. You know, companies, that whole sector. And it's massively implicated in that. It's not just directly working with or investing in. That's another thing they do. They've got huge indirect investments with Israel through their investment portfolio.
Yeah. Managed by BlackRock.
By BlackRock,
the worst company in the world. Now, I know the university knows this is a bad look, and it's been named by, you know, the QUB Palestine Assembly has put out press statements and so on. So I'd be pretty confident the university, under that pressure, is going to end that contract and so on. But issues like cybersecurity and surveillance, as well as then, you know, aeronautical engineering developments, you know, are still either directly or indirectly complicit in the Israeli war machine. You know, a bit like Invest Northern Ireland here. That I don't know what the figure is. I think it's a 20 million that they have helped fund local companies who they say are not involved in the F-34 fighter development. And the reason being is that because we're not making the planes here in the north of Ireland, but we're making some of the components that could be used to go on to be used. They're saying that that's the reason why they're not complicit. Whereas you have to look at the entire supply chain and saying, is there a chance that some of your investments are complicit in the genocide? Some of the technology you're producing is complicit in the genocide. That's the least we should be expecting. Rather than this mealy-mouthed, there's a general pot of investments that we could be indirectly. It's like saying, you can't be a little bit pregnant.
Yeah.
You know, it just is completely illogical.
Yeah. And then that is a big, it's not just the university, it's local politicians as well, isn't it? Because I don't know if you read the recent like F-35 report, Invest in I, how they've been plowing money into all these companies dotted around, which are making bits and pieces of the F-35. So it's not just the university, it's just politicians, including politicians who like to label themselves as pro-Palestine, who are actually making the weapons that are killing Palestinians on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And shout out to, I think it's Rowan Ellis O'Neill, who was the person that's been working on that Invest in I investigation. But yes, I mean, it's not just university, that's what we're focusing on. There's very few institutions of our society now, because we live in such a globalized world, and particularly anything to do with technology, because Israel has got such a, central part to play in electronic communications, a bit like Taiwan in terms of microchips and so on. And again, it's not an area I know particularly well, but it's only because of the genocide. You begin to say, oh my God, I used to know SodaStream, yeah, absolutely Israeli. But then you see all these other things that it's almost, it's difficult to think there's nothing is there anything that we use that hasn't been touched in some way by shape or form by Israeli, blood-soaked genocide pieces of technology. That's not to say that we should all rip open our phones and see, but it's just an example of globalized capitalism, which is why, for me, unless we connect the Palestinian liberation struggle with also the liberation of Europe and other peoples from this terrible system that we're in. So it's not just about Palestinian liberation, that in that process, then it's also about our own liberation. Oh, that sounds terribly woke and utopian. I don't give a shit. That's my view. That actually this moment is not just about the liberation of Palestine, but it's also our own humanity as well. I mean, I don't know whether you're at the meeting we had at Queen's there a few weeks ago, and this wonderful, very eloquent young Palestinian journalist, Abu Bakr Ahmed, came, and he was making the same point in a way, that we're fighting for our own humanity, our own liberation as much as it is for theirs.
Yeah, well, it's the same politicians who don't, which is a point we make all the time, who don't care about us. It's the old, again, quoting Tony Benn, take a look at what they do to
refugees.
If they could get away with it, they would do the same to you. So it's the same people who take no interest in our well-being.
But there is a connection to the boomerang effect. So we have violence and genocide being visited on the Palestinian people, and then we see the repression of protest here back home, including most recently, having a T-shirt that says, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action. Even a guy in Scotland that said, I support plasticine something.
Plasticine action, yeah.
He was arrested.
Yeah.
You say, if it wasn't so serious, it'd be absolutely laughable.
Yeah, well, that is the effect it's going to have ultimately. It's going to make a mockery of the police and the law, which, is may have negative effects even in the long term. There's some laws which are fine,
Sure.
You probably don't want people murdering
left
and right. So you probably want some respect for the law, but
sure. But sometimes the law's an ass, and that's an absolute case in it. Britain has an unenviable record of repressing, particularly in post-extinction rebellion, to go to my kind of more specialist area of academic research in terms of climate protests and so on. That ever since, that upsurge of climate activism pre-COVID, we've seen this repression of protest, which has now just been accelerated now because of the genocide in Gaza. But it didn't come out of anywhere. It's not as if suddenly because of the, Palestine action and pro-Palestinian protests, the British government is now bringing these repressive measures. They have been increasingly repressive over the past at least 15 years.
Yeah. It's like you say, the boomerang effect of this tweet I read not too long ago where it says that Britain's finding out what's like to be ruled by the British, which is exactly what you say. It's a whole colonial stuff which would have taken place elsewhere, and now British people are feeling some of that hitting them.
Or as Malcolm X said, this is the chickens coming home to roost.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't want people arriving in small boats, stop dropping the big bombs.
Yeah,
it's pretty simple.
The cartoon I remember saying a while ago, it showed split down the middle. On one side it was exports, and the other side was imports. The exports were missiles going over there. The imports were the people fleeing in the opposite direction, and that's the crux of it. It's a very strange form of cognitive dissonance on the right that they rage and rant about immigration, but don't recognise that the wars they support are what's.
Get Jim Alistair in here and pin him down to the chair and open his eyes and make him watch this, because he's just a classic example of that. But then, so you have the outright Zionists, pro-Israel, the likes of Alistair, and then you have the other kind of liberal hand-wringing two-sidesism. And for me, they're two cheeks of the same arse. I've got, in some respect, more respect for the Zionists, where they're coming from.
It's more straightforward.
But this liberal nonsense, I mean, there was an example of this where I was invited to a peace vigil in Bangor. And I got this, and it said, no flags, and it's all about bringing peace between Israel and Palestine. I said, for fuck's sake. Even Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, you cannot be silent in the face of a genocide, you're siding with the genociders. But that liberal kind of alliance-y, kind of hand-rigging, the two sides, fuck that. This is, you have to get way beyond that liberal moralizing. And that's where, you know, you get the sympathy. You move then to solidarity, which is basically, no, we got to stand full square behind the Palestinian liberation movement, including their internationally recognized right to use any means necessary, including armed resistance against an illegal occupation. And we can't, you know, tire of saying that again and again. And it's for the Palestinians to decide the future of their land. It's for Palestinians to decide if they want to elect Hamas again. This absolute bollocks that we've seen recently. On the one hand, Keir Starmer saying, oh, threatening Israel, we will recognize Palestine unless you do this. Or then this crap that's come out, what's it called, the New York Declaration that I think Canada come up with, that somehow they'll only, you know, recognize, not even recognize the independent state of Palestine, but they want Hamas to be gotten rid of. They won't even recognizing the Palestinian Authority. They've got to disarm, whereas Israel is not disarming. I mean, this is the ultimate in imperial arrogance, that they can determine the conditions under which another people shall live and create a nation state and a homeland for themselves. I mean, I'm not saying anything that you wouldn't agree with, but I think I would like us more to be emphasizing the Palestinian people are occupied as recognized under international law. They have every right under international law to use armed resistance to do what Hamas said, or what Hamas did on October the 7th. Yes. Do I think human rights abuses were committed? Absolutely. Probably war crimes as well. But to me, it was a breakout from a prison.
Yeah, that's how Norman Finkelstein described it.
You know, that's what it was. I mean, it was a Palestine was an open-air prison. And that's why, for me, and we've had many of these discussions at the university and these meetings that I and others have organised. For me, it's the best education that I think a lot of my students, or certainly I've had. You know, not to say other education experiences are to be denigrated, but we have an obligation, those of us particularly in privileged positions, whether it's a professor or those of us who live in moderately liberal or democratic societies like ours, we can't be silent at this moment. And we all have different agency and different resources and time, but we can all do something.
Yeah. Oh, that's 100% something you can do. Did you still live in Bangor yourself, or in that
I
area?
live in Hollywood.
Hollywood,
Our Vic Nasa, to give it its Gaelic name,
right,
County Undone.
But you would still be involved with it, because Bangor's a difficult case, isn't it? Those are those cases where it's very hard to get a foothold, and it's very hard to work out what the right level of activism is.
Well, I wouldn't recommend for colleagues to go and have a counter demonstration at the Bangor Marine Court Hotel, which is currently housing, I think, 40 migrants and so on, because there is a large underbelly of loyalist paramilitarism that I know only too well as a local councillor. One of the things about being a local councillor is you begin to see your community in a different way than you do perhaps as an ordinary citizen.
Yeah.
That's why I recommend everybody should have a go at being a councillor. I mean, it's long been a Green Party policy, although I don't know whether it's still there, that nobody should really be elected more than twice. You need to step down, allow somebody else in. And it's a good experience, everybody to take their turn, you know, as it were. So no, Bangor is a tough place. I mean, Ards and North Down in particular, it's probably the most unionist dominated part of the North in terms of the composition of the council and population. And also, interesting enough, although this is a Shin Scale Ella, it's where plantation started and the Clandyboy estate and so on. So anyway, that's completely gone off topic. So I'm not recommending Palestinian solidarity campaigns in Bangor. And again, I don't want to denigrate those who are doing this kind of peace vigil, but really that's making themselves feel good. It's safe. It's two sides, and it really isn't making their voice heard or who's on the side of liberation and emancipation here.
Yeah, it is just a unique climate here where it's just very difficult to find that niche and balance in how to do things properly. We're just switching to the other side of the Atlantic briefly. Well, shouldn't never be our focus. You always have to remember that your focus in politics should always be where you live. But there's interesting lessons to be taken from the States, at least. There were huge encampments there like a year ago. Probably most famously at Columbia, but they they came down on those incredibly heavily. I suppose that shows a couple of things. It shows you how central Zionism is to the ruling class, and how nothing can be allowed to touch it, and then just the extent to which universities are seen as an important point for thought control. Basically, you can't have the wrong ideas get in there. Would you agree with why there was so much? Really severe clampdown, rubber bullets fired, and lots of people beaten up by police. And
the violence. I mean, Turtle Island, to give it its indigenous name, America, has been inspirational in terms of student activism, and it has to be said, a lot of very brave academics who stood alongside and protected students as best they could. I mean, a lot of it came down to money. That Trump in particular was threatening to defund, and a lot of universities like Harvard and so on, they bent the knee. I mean, I know she resigned in the end. I forget the president or provost's name of Harvard, who came out with really anti-Palestinian solidarity statements and so on. And so it's not even that they're committed Zionists. Some of them might be, and we know the Israeli lobby and the Zionist lobby are very, very strong in politics and even in universities. But for some of them, it just came down to the fact that they didn't want to lose their funding that Trump was threatening them with. But even under the Biden administration, it was no better. Again, to use the analogy that I've used already, Trump and Biden, or Kamala Harris and Trump, two cheeks of the same arse. If Harris had been elected, do we think that would have been different? Maybe the bombs dropping on Gaza. Because remember, this is an Israeli-US war. And we should all, sometimes we forget that America supplies the weapons and gives them diplomatic cover, that America, it can turn off the tap today. So it's an American-Israeli war. But maybe if Harris had got elected, the bombs dropping would have had LGBTQ flags on them and so on. Right. That's the only difference it would have been. So we need to call out, that liberal, perspective that a lot of people put their hopes in the likes of Harris. But to go back to the student encampments, and there is a really good film. Is it called The Encampments?
It's called The Encampments,
and it really is a very good analysis, particularly because it's kind of fine-grained. It follows a couple of individuals, which always makes for compelling viewing about the bravery of students. And also, a universal kind of theme of when people are thrown into an extraordinary situation, you see them grow in confidence and so on. It's not something they chose to do, but they become good public speakers. They're able to organise themselves in a way they probably didn't think before. And that was wonderful to see. I mean, there was an education that those young people got as a result of that. But they also got an education in state violence and repression, including, because we don't have that usually in Europe, where campuses in America have their own police.
I think schools have their own police, shopping centres have their
own
police.
It's one of the most highly militarised societies on the planet, as well as having the highest level of incarcerated people, most of whom are Latino and black. There's a whole carceral industrial complex there as well. Yeah. But it was, as I say, very inspiring to see the young people rising up and so on. And also then for them to see that this is the limits of reform. When you see that you're asking for a really basic issue, recognize the genocide, cut all links to the Zionist entity and so on. They weren't asking for a socialist revolution and so on. They were just simply asking to do the right thing, to comply with international law and human rights. And that was the response that they got. So they learned a lot, particularly, as I say, in terms of the limits of reform.
And it's a sort of a dual lock they have over the funding of universities, isn't it, as well? It's the major private donors they have, which shows the harmful effects on democracy of rampant capitalism. If you have a few people at the top controlling all of society's wealth, they get to shape everything. Yeah. And then the state itself, like I think it was 400 million of funding Trump was trying to pull from Colombia. Yeah. If they didn't do things like reform their entire curriculum on West Asia, basically. It was to say you can't, if you're teaching about Palestine, do it this way. And I mean, are you aware of precedents of that? Or
the curricula? I mean, that is one of the...
and says you got to teach this, can't teach that.
It's one of the, if you like, sacrosanct and values of the academic world is academic freedom. Yeah. I mean, I can teach whatever I want. And I have done all my career. No one has ever told me I can't teach that, at least not yet. So with an opportunity that may happen. But that level of state authoritarianism is what people would claim. Oh, that's what's going on in North Korea or China and so on. And yet here it is in supposedly the mother of, the most democratic nation on the planet, leader of the free world and so on. So there's no precedent certainly in Britain and Ireland, but there are examples of individual academics being criticised by their university informally and formally in terms of their activism. And I can't rule out that may at some point happen to somebody like me. I'll have me collar felt or be called into the Vice Chancellor's office. I think there's probably been a few times where this may have happened, but I think because of the small little profile I have here, and I'm on BBC Radio Ulster every so often and so on, social media, I'm not backward about coming forward, that they probably calculated that it'd do them more harm than good to clamp down on somebody like me. And I'm not saying that to be, oh, look at me, am I brave out there doing all of this? I just wish there was more of us doing that. And it is, and there's been a lot of discussion. I'm a member of Academics for Palestine, an all-Ireland group of academics across the island. And we put out statements in support of colleagues in America and so on. But really, as educators, our job should be to educate our students and our communities. That to me is what I put a lot of effort into in terms of getting people to understand what's going on. Yes, if they want to go to a Palestinian solidarity, great. If you want to donate to Palestine Action, other Palestinian solidarity groups are available, great. But there are lots of opportunities for people to do things. And particularly for universities, we should be teaching on this issue. Knowledge is power. So let's arm ourselves.
To be teaching and, like you say, encouraging people to get involved, because that lived experience of actually being involved in activism teaches you more than any class could teach probably as well.
Absolutely.
The other thing I found amazing about those protests was the constant, well, I shouldn't find it amazing, but just the extent of it was the suggestion that there was rampant anti-Semitism going on. That's a place where basically everyone has a camera.
Yeah.
And we were told there's anti-Semitic incidents happening left and right, but somehow not one of these managed to end up in film.
Absolutely. It's the classic, abuse of anti-Semitism is real. Yeah. And absolutely there's nobody that can condone it. But, it's like, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, being critical of the state of Israel and so on. But yeah, it's constantly, even in the BBC where they platform pro-Israeli apologists, they almost now, the strategy seems to be they begin with setting it up that, there's a rise in anti-Semitism and keep going on about anti-Semitism to try and make the connection. And which sadly for a lot of the listeners who may be not educated in this, they're, to criticise Israel is to be anti-Semitic. And then if you go along with the IHRC definition of anti-Semitism, that makes that case. And that's really, really worrying. But for all of that, then there are people now who begin to understand, there is a difference between criticising the Zionist state and, being anti-Semitic. Yeah.
I think that's losing a lot of its power now. I think it would have had real power in the past, but I think it's probably been the boy who cried wolf at this point. It's been used once
But also, I think one of the amazing things that has, given me such hope is the amount of Jews who've come out themselves, anti-Zionist Jews, which I've never really seen before in pro-Palestinian solidarity and so forth. And that really, they are the most powerful voice to challenge anti-Semitism on that issue. To see them, and again, it was in America, but we've also had them in other parts of the world, including in our city. So shout out to Sue Pentel and, Jews for Palestine and so on. Yeah. And that is so powerful, even though it may be a small voice, it is amplified and it acts as a shield for those of us in the pro-Palestinian liberation movement and solidarity campaigns against that accusation of anti-Semitism.
It is, yeah, because it's pretty hard to claim that they're anti-Semitic.
But particularly when our opponents are often anti-Semitic Christian Zionists.
Yeah,
go figure that one.
That's something I was reading about the American student encampments. It's kind of like the most extreme example of it. It was apparently one of the Zionist mob who came along. There were sort of white supremacist types among them, and one of them screamed to the Palestinians, "We're finishing what Hitler started." It's like, and apparently no one on his side called them out for it.
Yeah,
it's that very strange alliance that Zionists have with the far right, because they've got a sort of largely around Islamophobia, I think, but it does reach those bizarre extremes.
But it's also locally here. Why is it? And I'll call it out. Why is it within loyalism that we find the most vehement anti-Semitic Christian Zionism. You know, why is it we don't see more? And again, I'm not saying we have to go and do a survey of people on the pro-Palestinian marches, but my sense is a lot of them probably are coming from a Catholic, Republican, nationalist background. You know, I can think of very prominent examples like the Reverend Bill Shaw. Shout out to Bill. You know, he's one of the few prominent, you know, clearly Protestant, you know, I don't know whether he's a unionist, but he's certainly a Protestant. He's obviously a reverend. But where are more? What, you know, how has this become a sectarian issue? I mean, there are historical reasons for it. The far right element within loyalist paramilitarism in particular, you know, Combat 18 and links with the far right are not, you know, new to the north of Ireland, and that kind of pro-Israel, I don't know whether it's that idea that certainly I remember reading about years ago that in some, you know, of the political imaginaries of unionism here, they are the lost tribe of Israel. Right. Which makes a connection then. And then the historical links of Israel being a loyal little Ulster.
Yeah, of course. That was
in the 20s and so on. Or how, you know, some of the B specials and the black and tans that were used, so the black and tans, not the B specials, that were used in the Irish, you know, War of Liberation were then shipped off to a British mandate Palestine. So there are particular connections with the north of Ireland and what's going on there. In fact, I'm just giving myself a note in my head now. I must say that might be a good discussion to have at the university. What are the historical and other links between the north of Ireland, and you know, Palestine?
It's something we get into quite a lot in this podcast. It comes up frequently. There's just those very natural links, like the black and tans you mentioned, like the sort of techniques of repression used by British forces there were ones they'd originally tested in Ireland. Things like strapping people to the front of a jeep or demolishing the homes of people who were resisting. They're demolishing the family home, which happened in Ireland, happened in Palestine back then, and is still happening today. A lot of the techniques are still in use. So Britain has a long history of responsibility before its participation in this current Holocaust, obviously. Just before we wrap up, I suppose we'll move on to something you might be your main strength is sort of the environmental issues. And what I mentioned at the start, the Ecocide in Gaza. You mentioned all the different sides. There's been CIDs. There's been all very deliberate. And Ecocide is no different. So it's the destruction of all the farmland, destruction of all the livestock, wrecking the water systems, the sewage treatment systems, the air quality from the constant bombing. It's, again, that's something that probably doesn't have much of a precedent in the extent of it.
No, I mean, it didn't come out of nowhere. Even before the current genocide that's been going on for decades. You know, the destruction of Palestinian olive groves, raw sewage being dumped on the hillside of an illegal Israeli settlement, then being, you know, shoved down into an olive grove. Olives are particularly important in terms of, you know, Palestinian resistance and so on. But, you know, I forget the exact figures. I think the greenhouse gas emissions, that's the major cause of the climate crisis, CO2, carbon dioxide. The Israeli bombardment has released more than 50 countries or something like that.
In a year, is that a year's usage of?
That's since the genocide started. So it's the equivalent of 50 countries since October. The IOF have actually now created. In other words, it's contributing to the global climate calamity. Obviously, there's local destruction of soils, the irradiation. They're probably using depleted uranium shells and so on. The remediation of the soil is going to take decades and so on. Never mind the reconstruction of buildings and whatever. Although if that bastard Smotrich gets his way, he just come out and he said their view was just to demolish the whole lot. Not turning into a wasteland. So for me, that's what ecocide is. It's the deliberate destruction of the life supporting systems of a local area. And it's been a weapon of war, of course, for centuries and not thousands of years. But it's particularly evident now because we have, you know, drone footage we can compare. You've probably seen them where there's a picture of, you know, Palestinian olive groves, orchards, greenhouses prior to the genocide and then after and so on. And particularly around, you know, food production and the ecology of the region. There's a whole issue about how colonization under Zionism was as much about displacing native flora and fauna as it was about displacing the people. So bringing in European trees like pine trees, which now fucking burn in the heat.
I think these enormous fires there.
They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be there. Trying to bring in a kind of a European eco colonized element to it, and also then not adhering to the local ecological conditions in terms of food production and so on, which the Palestinians who've been there for thousands of years, then like all indigenous peoples, they've adapted to their local environment. So there's a whole issue about the way in which the ecological lens is not just about the bombing and the death and the air pollution, soil pollution. It is all that and climate change, but it's also the ways in which nature itself has attempted to be transformed by colonizers. You see that in every colonized society in terms of bringing in plants and so on from the home, the colonizing country and so on. We've seen that in Palestine, and I have to say we had him here at Queen's as part of the QUB Palestine Assembly series of talks. Mazin Quimza, who fantastic scholar, Palestinian Christian. If anyone wants to check him out, he has a really good set of articles, research about the importance of cultivating and conserving indigenous plants and flora and fauna as part of the resistance.
Preserving your culture, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And someone sent me an article literally yesterday. It was a sort of farming website randomly just showing us that it had to use the classic propaganda phrase or variation of it. The desert, Israel
like the desert bloom.
Made the desert bloom.
That is the biggest propaganda lie ever.
Like you say, it's Palestinians who were the foundation for a lot of that. That was the Zionist settlers, or land thieves is the right term to use around the settlers, used indigenous Palestinians to show them how to till the land, basically.
Absolutely. Now that is another part of the ideology of colonization and of the Zionist entity. Is this idea that they brought modernity, they brought, all the fruits of European culture and civilization, the only democracy in the Middle East or West Africa. Absolute bollocks. But particularly the desert bloom idea has just gained so much traction, just even as like a folk memory people have. And unless you do the historical research, that you might be taken in by it, that somehow these Bedouin, nomadic people, rather backward-looking, Islamic, conservative, and so on, that here we have these poor people, the Israelis come around the world, the Jews suffering the Holocaust. If you watch the Paul Newman film that based on Leon Urs, the foundation of Israel.
Exodus?
There's this great historical propaganda. And I have to say, there's a whole issue there. And again, another note to myself, the ways in which the Israeli propaganda machine has produced and pumped out a lot of films, whether it's Golda Meir with Helen Mirren in it, whether it's the one about the raid on Entebbe and so on, all these heroic, motifs, which of course we know more than any Palestinian version in terms of cultural products like that. But that idea of the desert blooming is absolute nonsense, but it makes it nonetheless powerful just because it's nonsense. That's the essence of ideology. It doesn't have any referent in reality. It's because of what you feel. Yeah. And if you hear it often enough in different ways, people end up believing it. But it needs to be absolutely challenged, because that is one of the elements of the tool of colonialists, that they want to control the past, the narrative of the past and so on, which is why we should never stop talking about the Nakba. It didn't happen on October the 7th. There was a long history here going back even before that. And that's why it's often difficult when you go on the media, because they don't want to talk about that. So, let's talk about Hamas and the two sidesism. And I do think that we're much better now in the Palestinian liberation movement. Those I've listened to in the media are really good at constantly bringing it back. And then there's these wonderful examples, like the kid in England who's been interviewed about his A-levels.
That's really caught on.
It just that's memeable. That is fantastic.
It's just like that.
But unfortunately, I think some of those GCSE students who received their grade yet, they may have had the same idea, but the BBC were probably monitoring it and so. But fair play, bear buia to those students, and that student in particular.
It was always brilliant. I'm surprised that's been shared to me about 50 times by now, I think. We all have a fantasy of saying like something like that when we're just giving a bland interview about A-levels.
Well, it happened yesterday, apparently. My wife was telling me on BBC Radio Ulster during, of all things, I think the Conor Phillips show. So it wasn't William Crawley or Nolan. It's one of the, the music and chat. Oh, yes, they were giving away free tickets to Picture This. And somebody won it. And whatever, they wanted to answer questions, so on. And then your woman, fair play, I don't know who she is, so shout out to whoever she is. She said, "Oh, can I say one more thing, Conor?" "Oh, yeah, free Palestine." Fair play.
Class. Apparently they're monitoring those much more closely now, those phone-ins. Like, we've tried to get people on and it's very hard to get through. They're really sort of...
You need to be George from the Shankill.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I need to be George from the Shankill. Maybe get Bill Shaw to do or something. I can maybe pull that off. So just the other thing about that is actually just, in terms of explaining the past, is that the format of media, it's all about concision. It's all about just very short little snippets, so you never get that chance to go into what the past is actually like.
I have to say, my own experience, I judge quite carefully because the BBC even today were contacting me about going on, and I like to do my preparation. I always ask, who am I on with? How long do we have? Which is why if I have a preference, I always go for the Sunday sequence show on the Sunday, because you can get up to half an hour.
You get a choice?
Well, no. If they offer me Sunday sequence, I always take that.
Okay, yeah.
I often take Talk Back, because I think William Crawley is not bad. He's
not the worst.
He's not the worst of them. Stephen Nolan, I'm very reticent about going there. And then the BBC news programmes, I partly, I've done them, but I don't like doing them because they literally only have 5 minutes. Yeah. And it's the reason, folks, if you've ever wondered, this is me speaking partly as an ex-politician, but as much as a media commentator, if you ever shout at the radio and say, "You didn't answer the question," the reason is very simple. Certainly as a politician, I remember, I'm going to only have 5 minutes on here. I have 3 things to say. I don't give a shit what I'm being asked. I've got my 3 things to say, and that's the reason. So I think media training, a lot of us been learning on the job, but it probably would be useful for those of us who have been talking in the media about this, maybe at some point to debrief. And because you do need to have storylines, and you do need to have, in my view, good phrases. Ecocide, genocide, and so on, that kind of sticks in your head. What the hell is that? Ecocide, genocide.
Consistent messaging across all of us.
Yeah, but also having memeable, like short, pithy sayings. Like, that's the reason why, in my view, the whole Brexit referendum was lost, because the Remain side was shite. Take back control. Sounds great. What the fuck's it mean? I don't know, but I'm going to... So anyway, the other side is, giving away control. So it's just simple ways in which you can try and make something land with... often the people who are listening in the media, they're not particularly political. So you need to remember that. They're not like us activists and so on. So you got to remember, as I always say to my mother, as a good working class Dublin woman, I always ask the Mammy Barry question. She's not particularly political, but she said to me, and I was going on about Palestine and genocide, she said, "John, stop. I don't need to know the history. I know when I see a genocide." And for a lot of people, that's what we need to remember. People are mostly decent. They want fairness. They can see this. But I think we can overcomplicate things often. Obviously, it depends on what the issue is. But certainly, I think the framing of this debate now has shifted. The Zionist framing, I think, is losing traction very, very quickly, because people can see now with their own eyes that they're talking absolute falsehoods and bullshit and calling them out for it.
Yeah. They've been given impunity for so long that they've over-egged the pudding to some extent. They've just gone to a point where they can't reel it back.
Well, particularly as you mentioned there, I mean, somebody denying there's a famine when the UN, and not particularly often progressive or active organisation, I think the UN could have done an awful lot more in terms of, as President Higgins says, using as Article 2 or 4 of barring Israel from the UN General Assembly, or actually mobilising an international peacekeeping force and so on. So the UN has not covered itself in glory, although Antonio Guterres, coming out with strong statements. So when the UN says there's a famine and you got some IOF general denying it, who are you going to believe?
Yeah.
And ask yourself, why? Why would you believe one rather than the other?
Yeah. I think I say it should be guilty until proven innocent, because that's consistent record of proven lying over and over again. Just a final question before we wrap up. It's just about the climate side of things. About obviously there's a partly because of what so-called Israel's been doing. There's a build-up of militarism. It's just created this sense, along with the Russia-Ukraine war, that the world is becoming more unstable, or we're led to believe. So this build-up of militarism, and that is an underreported effect on climate change. Like just the everyday use of military training, just production. It's not tracked. Apparently, it's exempt from like things like EU rules.
It's not covered.
Yeah.
Military emissions. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions from navies, territorial armies, and the biggest one, of course, being the US. The US Army is the single biggest entity that emits greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
That it's exempt. And in the context of Europe quickly militarising itself, even Ireland down south, this elite push to get Ireland to join NATO, spend money on the military, is going to have a massive impact on the climate, even apart from the fact that for every tank that you build, well, that could be a wind farm.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity cost in terms of resources, labour, and so on. So it's a direct impact on the climate crisis, and one that most people don't realise about the connection between the climate crisis and militarism. It has to do with fossil fuels. Is that America spends, and it's from 2018 because I was teaching this not so long ago. America spent in 2018 $8 billion on military protection of oil supply routes, the Straits of Hormuz, protect them against, disruption and so on. So fossil fuels are the major cause of the climate crisis, as well as dropping of bombs and munitions. Also, more locally, cows farting and belching also cause it. So we have a major problem on the island of Ireland because we have too many cows. But militarism is obviously a bigger issue. That it's not only about the opportunity cost, that for every tank we build, that's less a kidney dialysis machine. We've got to ask ourselves, why is there always money for war and not for the NHS? But also then the exemption of military emissions from the inventories of greenhouse gas emissions, means that we're hurtling quicker and faster towards a climate catastrophe. It's already here. Just because we're not seeing the same impact of the climate crisis as countries in the global south. I mean, Pakistan has suffered recent devastating floods, as it did a couple of years ago, loss of life, crops, livelihoods, and so on. Heat waves in part of Asia that were so severe, birds are dropping out of the sky. So the climate crisis is already here. This militarization is only going to hasten that. And that's what I really fear, is that this rush, particularly down south, of political elites, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, again, two cheeks of the same arse, pushing for Ireland to become more militarised and so on, never mind across Europe. And of course, hastened by Donald Trump saying, well, he's going to remove American, support for NATO, that unless the Europeans pay for it. Even the recent deal, inverted commas or whatever, of peace negotiations between Putin and Zelensky in terms of Russia-Ukraine, where America said, we're not putting boots on the ground. So in Europe, you need to spend more money on militarization and build-up. And in a way, that's what really worries me. It's rather a depressing thought to end with, but it's sobering, and it's certainly my assessment. There's more than a smell of the 1930s about our current moment.
100%.
That build-up of militarism, of war, ongoing imperialism, increasing class division, xenophobia. And that's why, as an Marxist, what we're currently seeing is the truth of that Marxist idea that fascism is capitalism in decline. That's what we're now witnessing. The emergence of some new iteration of fascism, which of course we see alive and well in the Zionist entity.
Yeah, it is a very real case of socialism or barbarism. We're seeing barbarism in its most stark form, and there's even bigger threats that potentially await us if it's larger scale war, larger scale climate destruction. So, John, thanks very much for it is grim stuff, but it's very illuminating what you've brought there, and thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
No problem. And just to remind everybody, it's not socialism or barbarism, it's barbarism if we're lucky. But get me on again, I'll talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thanks again.
Good.